Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Joji Waits, Head of Flight Safety at BALPA, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all for the fourth and final webinar of the BALPA GATCO Safety Symposium. It's great to see some familiar names joining us again, and also some new attendees. I hope you enjoy the session. Owing to the skills, training, and professionalism of the people involved across the whole system, aviation is an incredibly safe industry. However, on rare occasions, things do go wrong. And in this session, we'll highlight how through effective investigation of specific events and analysis of safety reports, we can learn lessons to help improve safety in the future. We're also mindful of the need to treat those involved in such investigations and safety reporting with the respect demanded of a good safety culture. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, Rob Clements, an Operations Inspector at the UK Air Accidents Investigation Branch, and Steve Forward, the Director of Aviation at CHIRP. Rob and Steve will introduce themselves more fully in a moment as part of their presentations. Following the presentations, there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. Could I please remind the audience to use the dedicated Q&A function to submit your questions? It's just easier for us to keep track of questions if they're separated from the general comments. You can also make via the chat facility. Also to remind you that this session is being recorded. Our plan today is to finish by 12 PM UK time. So without further ado, over to Rob, who will talk us through a recent incident investigated by the AAIB. Hey, Rob.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Well, the first challenge is I'll try and share my screen, so I'll just see if I can make that work. So I don't have the option to share anymore. Is it one of you guys still sharing it?
Try that, Rob.
That's better. Is that working? Can you see that screen now?
Come across perfectly, Rob. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. As you heard, my name's Rob Clements. I'm one of the inspectors at the Air Accident Investigation Branch. Just a quick introduction. So I'm an operations inspector, so a pilot by background. I've been with the AIB for 5 years now. Prior to that, I was a pilot with British Airways. I spent 15 years flying with them. But as part of this job, I still get to fly. So I still, for the last 5 years, I've been flying with BA once a month. But just currently in the process of switching across to fly with Virgin. So I'm in the middle of my type rating course to fly the 787 with Virgin at the moment. So that's keeping me busy at the moment. I thought I'd talk to you today about a takeoff performance event that I investigated last year. It's got some interesting sort of piloting and ATC aspects. I should point out I'm not an ATC expert, so as a pilot by background, so I apologise to any of the people on the call who are experts if I say anything on that area side that's wrong. We just had some people support us during the investigation. So, this event, say it's been published now. So the report into this is out there in the public domain. So I know some of you may have read it, but hopefully I can add a few bits of extra information that will make this interesting. So this event was a 737. The event actually took place in December 21, and it was on takeoff from Kuusamo Airport, which is up in Finland, in Lapland. Hopefully you can see it there on the map, quite close to the Russian border, which will become relevant shortly. And the sort of summary of the event was the incorrect thrust set on takeoff, so less thrust than was required on the takeoff roll. But the aircraft did get airborne and was able to carry on its flight back to Stansted. Important to say probably at this stage, as I talk through this, there's no criticism intended of any of the people who are involved in this event. They're all, like any of us, just trying to do the best job they can on the day, but hopefully we can take some useful lessons away from it. So this is Kuusamo Airport, for anyone who doesn't know the airport at all. It's a 2,500 meter long runway, 800 feet, 850 feet above sea level. Quite a small airfield, so you can see there the apron is just up to the northwest corner of the airfield. Quite a small little apron where you drive into the stands and drive back out again. It was quite light winds on the day. You can see down there at the bottom corner, the winds fully across the runway. So that meant the crew were able to land in one direction and take off in the other direction. So they landed on runway 30 and then the short taxi onto stand, and then took off from 12 back in the opposite direction. Weather conditions, standard winter weather up there. So it was snowing. Runway was covered with 3 mils of snow, cold at -8 degrees. And they were giving a runway condition code of 4. So slightly worse than the 3 mils of snow would suggest. It was also at night time. This photo here is not actually from the day of the incident. It was taken a couple of days later, but similar conditions. So that's a photo from the ATC tower. So you can see what the controller or the FISO could see from their position. So that's the aircraft sat at the holding point, ready to take off. Worth saying, there's no radar here. So the radar starts at about 4,000 feet when they're handed over to the area controller. The service here changes from ATC service to FISO. So when the aircraft came in to land, it was an ATC service, but that switched to a FISO service just before they landed, and it was a FISO service when the aircraft departed. So what actually happened? So the outbound flight was absolutely uneventful. They used the flight out to brief cold weather ops. They knew it was going to be obviously snowy and cold out there, so they'd used the outbound flight to talk about that in the cruise. And the aircraft landed on runway 30 there without incident. It was right at the start of the lap-bound flight, so the return sector was empty. There's no passengers on board, so the return sector was just 2 pilots and the 4 cabin crew, and therefore a reasonably light aircraft. Aircraft was de-iced on stand, and they did their normal performance calculations for a derated takeoff. But with the contamination, you'll see they're quite low speed. So the 93 knots V1 speed is quite a low speed. And on that, you can see the calculated takeoff thrust of 89%. It's going to be the co-pilot's sector for the return flight. And as I said before, it is now a flight information service. So it's a self-positioned stand, so there's no pushback. So they just start up engines on stand and taxi out from there. With this operator, the captain always does the taxiing, so first officers aren't able to taxi. So the captain taxied the aircraft from that position out on the short way out onto the runway. As normal in contamination, they select the flaps just as they line up. So that's another slightly unusual procedure. And you can see there, the runway is still covered with 3 mils of snow with light snow and dark conditions. In those conditions, like most aircraft, you need to do a static run up in the 737. So it's a 30-second run up. So you run the engines up to 70%, hold it against the brakes for 30 seconds, and then release the brakes. But on this takeoff, the captain lined up the runway, handed the control over to the co-pilot. And at that point, they told the FISO they were ready for departure. And the FISO said the runway's clear and gave them the wind. The co-pilot advanced the thrust levers to 70%, but as he did that, he perceived the aircraft started to slide, which was obviously quite alarming for him. There's snowbanks at the side of the runway, and this aircraft was starting to yaw a little bit as it did that. So this is something they'd talked about that might happen before. They've talked about it in the briefing that the aircraft might slide. So they'd briefed if that happened, they would just release the brakes and continue the takeoff, which is what they did. But in that moment, with the aircraft starting to slide and yaw, the co-pilot didn't press the toga buttons, which would normally set the takeoff thrust. So the power at that point was still at 70% that they'd been using for the run-up. Just as that moment, so as the first officer was, or the co-pilot was trying to steer the aircraft down the runway, he'd taken his hand off the thrust lever, and the captain put his hand onto the thrust levers, their normal procedure. But just as that happened, the FISO called them and said, "Can you confirm you're turning right after departure?" Quite interesting why she made that call. There's some local procedure there that normally most pilots are familiar with this airfield when they get their when they read back the takeoff clearance, they will say turning right after departure. But this crew didn't know that. They weren't particularly familiar with FISO, and it's not written down anywhere that you have to do that. And in the Finnish AIP, it says standard turns after takeoff are left turns. The FISO obviously can't issue a takeoff clearance, so she can't give them an instruction as to what to do after departure. So without that confirmation, she didn't know what they were going to do. From the crew's perspective, they'd been cleared to a waypoint that was to the south of the airport, so they just assumed they were going to take off, climb to 1,000 feet and turn direct to the point they'd been cleared to. So they didn't realize they needed to confirm that. But from the FISO's perspective, with a danger area to north, the Russian border ahead of them, she obviously wanted to know where they were going to route after takeoff. So that's why she made that call. The captain answered that call, so he just confirmed they were turning right after departure. But in the moment of answering that, he then missed his thrust set call. Obviously a light aircraft, so it's accelerating quite quickly. They made the 80 knots call as normal, but the thrust remained set at the 70% value throughout the takeoff roll. So both pilots reported that they recognized something was wrong during the takeoff roll, but they couldn't quite work out what it was. Relatively low V1 speeds, that came quite quickly. The captain said he recognized that the acceleration didn't feel normal, but he was also thought that may well be the contamination, couldn't quite resolve what it was. The aircraft did get airborne. The co-pilot described it as quite a heavy rotation, and described it sort of the aircraft climbing like it would be an engine failure in the sim. So sort of just the speed just hovering at V2 and climbing very slowly. Also at that point, he noticed it didn't have a vertical flight director. They got up to about 400 feet and the co-pilot said we need more power, and the captain realized they didn't have the takeoff power set and was able to advance the thrust levers back to the correct 89%. And then from that point, the flight carried on as normal, so it was then able to get back into the climb as normal and were able to continue the flight back to Stansted. So interestingly, when we started looking into the data of this event afterwards, we discovered the aircraft wasn't actually sliding at all at the start of the takeoff roll. It was actually that there was insufficient brake pressure applied, so the aircraft was just rolling as the aircraft was actually just rolling and there wasn't enough brake pressure applied. So let me get my slides to advance. So as we mentioned before, co-pilots in this operator don't taxi the aircraft and don't very often have need to apply a large amount of brake pressure. They only use the brakes on landing. And the co-pilot just wasn't aware or hadn't been trained on how much travel the brake pedals have and how much brake pressure you can apply if you push them all the way forward. And because he wasn't applying enough pressure, that's why the aircraft moved at the start of the roll. And when we looked into this afterwards, the operator had found several events through their flight data where this had happened in the past as well. So, analysed the takeoff rate. The aircraft could have stopped if it had an engine failure before V1, but if there'd been an engine failure any time after V1, the aircraft wouldn't have been able to safely fly away from the runway. So let's talk through some of the factors that contributed to this event happening. So experience is quite an important part of this. The crew were generally quite an experienced crew. Both pilots had a lot of hours on the 7.3, but very little experience of cold weather ops. Neither of them had operated to Kosovo before, and the co-pilot hadn't had to do a run up anywhere before. The captain had done it a few times, but not a procedure they were particularly familiar with. And also, the co-pilot didn't really have experience of using brake pressure or how much brake pressure you need to do a run up. Possibly interesting that they briefed that the aircraft might slide, so the act of briefing it almost sort of was a precursor to them thinking that when the aircraft did start to move, they'd already briefed that might happen. So that sort of confirmed that was what was happening rather than it might be insufficient brake pressure. Startle was certainly another factor in there. So I'm sure you're all familiar with startle, this sort of innate human reaction when you get a threatening stimulus comes along, and we have this kind of involuntary response to it that we can't really stop ourselves doing. It's just part of being human. But certainly when the aircraft started sliding and yawing and moving towards the snowbanks, that startle reaction kind of immediately draws your attention into dealing with that. So you can see that's why the co-pilot was immediately drawn into steering the aircraft down the runway and trying to control the aircraft. And perhaps that's why he missed the TOGA press. Distraction is another factor in there. It's interesting that the reasons why the FISO made that call, but once that call had been made, it's very hard for the captain not to be distracted by that. You can't really not hear the call from air traffic once that's made. It captures your attention. You have to listen to it and decide. Even you could have a discussion about whether the captain should or shouldn't have answered the call, but either way, it requires mental effort to listen to it and decide if you're going to answer it or not. So the distraction has already occurred at that stage. And it's interesting, once you get that sort of distraction, the takeoff role of doing the thrust set calls, or kind of sequential tasks, once you've interrupted that normal sequence, it's quite hard to get back into and realize what it was that was missed earlier in the process. You tend to find when a process like that is distracted, people don't go back very well to find what task was missed earlier in the sequence. So we mentioned before that the FISO made the decision to make the transmission just at the start of the takeoff roll. She was well aware, as you know, that the requirement not to distract the flight crew during the takeoff roll. But it was an interesting risk trade-off with her concern about where the aircraft was going to route after takeoff with the proximity of the Russian border. Having no radar and it being dark, so she couldn't monitor what the aircraft did once it got airborne. And being used to the local procedure that pilots would normally report they're going to turn right after takeoff. So it's interesting that she made that sort of trade-off as to what was the bigger risk. And from her perspective, the aircraft was either hadn't moved yet or was only just starting to move. So considered it was the more important thing was to confirm the routing after departure. We talked also about the expectation bias. When the takeoff roll wasn't proceeding as expected, the crew were trying to work out what was wrong. But they had already briefed that they were in cold weather, so they had an expectation that things might be a little different. They knew they were on a contaminated runway. They knew the aircraft was light, so they were expecting it to feel a little bit different. So they found it easier when presented with something that wasn't quite right, and they knew something wasn't quite right, to sort of discount it as being that was the reason. Although there obviously were cues on the flight deck that the takeoff thrust wasn't set, from the thrust gauges, from the FMAs were not correct, that the flight path, the flight directors weren't correct. So there were cues there, but it's very easy to get into this expectation bias where it's easier to interpret those signals and explain them away. And perhaps the last bit that's quite interesting, this is perception of acceleration. A lot of pilots you talk to think they would be able to detect insufficient acceleration. But the research shows as pilots, we aren't very good at spotting low acceleration. We've investigated quite a few of these sort of similar events, and generally pilots don't detect, even when the acceleration is quite markedly outside normal, pilots generally don't spot, or at least the cues aren't compelling enough for the pilots to do anything about it, like to stop or to add more power. I'd say from our research, relying on flight crew to detect lack of acceleration is not very reliable. We've investigated quite a few of these events now. We've looked at 32 of them since 2017. And despite the sort of robust critical data procedures that all operators have for loading takeoff performance data, checking the data, and then executing that plan, these events seem to keep happening. We keep seeming to have takeoff performance events. All operators seem to have a lot of these events. The SOPs we have work very well a large number of times, but they don't seem to capture every event. So the AAIB are campaigning to have a technical solution to this. So what we'd really like to see is all aircraft fitted with some kind of takeoff performance monitoring or a low acceleration monitoring system. There are several solutions out there. most of the manufacturers have various solutions, but they're not fitted to aircraft, or at least systems that are reliable enough are not fitted yet. So we've made these recommendations before, but the outcome of this was a further recommendation to develop technical standards or certification standards for an onboard system to alert crew to low takeoff acceleration. So we're hopeful that that will start to happen soon. We're also trying to encourage all operators to use their flight data monitoring to look for these events, because we think at the moment it's quite underreported. There are more events out there, and if we can get more evidence, that supports the case further to develop technical solutions. So hopefully that was interesting. I've gone through that reasonably quickly because I was conscious of time, but I think Steve's going to speak and then we'll have questions at the end.
Many thanks, Rob, for that fascinating presentation. It's, as well as the sort of subject matter and takeoff performance events. We know the trending of those events is reasonably high. It's just interesting to hear the different factors coming together. Distraction, trade-offs that have been made in the situation, startle factor being present. So we see those sort of factors in many events in aviation. So look forward to sort of drilling down into that in the Q&A a bit later. But I will now hand over to Steve, who will share with us his insights on information collected through CHIRP. So the floor is yours, Steve. I'm going to make you co-host so you're able to share your screen. Let me just do that. Hopefully that should work for you, Steve.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe G. And hello, everybody. Let me just share my screen there and see if it does work. Looking good so far. Yep. It says. Okay. Hope everybody can see that now on the screen.
Yeah, it's come across perfect, Steve. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, hi, everybody. As I said before, my name is Steve Ford. I'm Director of Aviation at CHIRP, the Confidential Human Factors Incident Reporting Programme. I've been in the job for about 3 years now, and I came to this role from the Airprox Board. So just to give a bit of a background to myself, military aviator in the past, until the Airprox Board and this. So I'm not a commercial aviation pilot. Military and GA are my background. So I say that up front so that if you've got any questions on what I'm asking, then just bear with me in that I'm not an expert, as you probably all are, in many of the aspects I'm going to talk about. In the last 3 years, I've picked up quite a lot of it anyway, but just to give that the precursor first. So what I want to go and talk about is a little bit about what CHIRP does to start with. I thought I'd take this opportunity just to put an advert for CHIRP, what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve. So maybe 4 or 5 slides there. I won't take too much time on that. And then some themes, what we've seen in 2022 and the big issues that are coming to CHIRP in aggregate. I don't intend to go into individual reports for confidentiality reasons, although I may touch on a few things. I don't tend to do a blow-by-blow account, as Rob has just done on one instant, because with most of the stuff we talk about, then you can probably, those who may be familiar, work out who, or at least the company that was involved. So CHIRP then, what we're about is, well, it says speaking truth under power. So that's part of it, really. The large part is obviously to highlight human factors issues and try and resolve them before they become incidents or accidents themselves. We were set up in '82, a long time back now, as part of the thrust to really understand human factors, really. In the 70s and 80s, it became clear that there were quite a few things that were happening out there that weren't being reported. And just as an example, various reviews of accidents and incidents kind of settle on the conclusion about 75 to 80% of accidents have a human factors aspect, as Rob has just shown you with the one in Finland. But only about, I want to say now, about 10% of reports overtly mention human factors. So the big disparity still in what's being reported and what's being and the factors involved. We became a charity in the mid-90s with a focus on that human factors and confidential reporting, as I mentioned before, and promoting what then became more in vogue, the just culture thing and the non-judgmental approach to incident reporting. Now, it's important to say that we focus mostly on the UK. We do look at some stuff which comes in, foreign operators flying into the UK airspace, but we're not really equipped and set up to resolve issues with non-UK operators, although we have in the past tried. We don't tend to get the purchase. So mostly UK. And it's also important to say that we are wholly funded by the CAA. So before that starts ringing alarm bells, just to let you know that in that funding, it's hands-off activity. States are required to do confidential reporting, and it happens that the UK has chosen to fund us to do their confidential reporting, so that they can then have an absolutely identifiable step removed from those reports themselves. So our independence is assured. So yes, I get funded by the CAA. I have to ask for those funds and prove what I'm doing on an annual basis, but they are not looking over my shoulder. They're not looking at our reports. They have no access to our database. I do feed information back to them as part of that, and that's an important part of our role, to provide intelligence on things that are happening, so they can then act as they see fit as a regulator. But they don't see individual reports. So your identities and circumstances are all safe with CHIRP, and touch wood, we've not had a breach of a person's identity yet in those 50 odd years we've been operating, 45 years. I mentioned what we do with the reports, and that's an important thing, unlike the AAIB, where there's a statutory requirement. If they ask you to come and give them information, then you are required to do it. We're very much in the voluntary world. We have no authority, no levers to pull. We can't change anything. We can recommend things and champion things, but in the end, it is the regulator or the industry that chooses or chooses not to change things. I've said both regulator and most companies are pretty proactive, actually. I get a fairly good response when I approach them as CHIRP. They're generally grateful for issues have been raised, and they do, well, regulator, certainly industry, sometimes try and enact changes based on that. And the other important thing I think up front is that it's not just me, it's not the thoughts of Director Steve. The way we do this is we have a set of what we call advisory boards, which are set up with a bunch of your peers who sit on basically a 3-monthly basis in the flight crew, cabin crew, GA and drone environments, and they review reports and give me their thoughts, advice, recommendations on how to deal with those reports. So that's where I get my information from. So that's why me not being a commercial pilot is not a hamper. They give me the information and they discuss and provide me the fidelity of advice with which we then write our comments or whatever. So we like to think we're impartial and unbiased, and it's a consensus of those people. And just to show you that, the 4 boards I mentioned, an air transport advisory board that deals with the flight crew, the engineering side of life, air traffic control side of life, and all the things that go part and parcel with air transport, except for the cabin crew. And the reason for that is, as you'll see later in the stats, cabin crew reporting is the largest part of our reporting sector, so they merit their own advisory board, and that happens on a 4-monthly basis for cabin crew. General aviation and drones. Drones is actually a new one for us. About a year or so ago, we set up the drone board, and that's beginning to build. Reports come into me, well, the Secretariat really, and I say the Secretariat, and I'm Director of Aviation. It sounds very grand, doesn't it? But actually, we're a very small team. So I run a cabin crew program manager, an engineering program manager, a drone program manager, and recently a ground handling and security program manager. And we're all part-time. So our resources are stretched. So plea for, if you do report, then patience please, because we've got a fair amount on, and because we're not working full time, it can take a little bit of a while to respond. We try and do that within 10 days if we can do, but it's not a quick process. The CHIRP process is there to resolve issues which may well be ongoing that you can't resolve through your own reporting systems. So it's not a quick fix. By the time we get hold of it, decide or agree with the reporter what's going to happen and who we're going to talk to, we do that. We get responses back. We're looking at a couple of months at least for a particular report. So that's just to manage expectations. What are we doing? I'll just canter through this slide a little bit. Everybody has to have a mission, don't they? That's ours. So what we're after then, we are really trying to focus on the leadership and awareness of safety issues in CHIRP as a sort of a way of highlighting issues to those who should know and should be in that space to maybe improve what they're doing. Safety culture, changing behaviours, yes, that's a big part of our world. Trying to resolve issues, as I mentioned before they become accidents and incidents, ideally, but trying to make things as safe as possible and get our outcomes and our recommendations adopted. And as I said, that's a bit of an uphill task at times because we have no regulatory authority to do anything. People don't have to listen to us, they do, but they don't have to. That all sounds grand, doesn't it? The reality of all that, well, we sort of position ourselves as a safety net. So the first thing you should do with any issue, incident or whatever, in reality, is to go through the ASR process, MORs, because that, as I said before, is the quickest way of getting a resolution by going through the company, highlighting the issue. Hopefully, the company will be enlightened enough to say, thanks so much for that. We understand there's an issue, or here's why it's this way. We'll provide a response of some sort. They'll have all the facts and all the material, and you'll get something done, hopefully within, ideally, days or weeks. When that doesn't work, and you don't get the resolution that you think is attracted to the incident or the issue, then we can get involved and just provide another way of feeding that information in to regulators or airlines. Say, hey, we've got this report, what do you think? And that can often provoke a different response. There are issues of that because, of course, if you've reported to the company, then you report to us, and then we report the same issue to the company, and then they'll probably know who it was that reported the issue in the first place. So we have to be very careful what we do, and that's a bit of why it takes us a while to agree with reporters who we're going to talk to. It's sometimes the case when a reporter will have gone through the ASR MOR route, and then they come to us and say, well, I don't really want you to go through the company, but I'm happy to go through the CAA, who can then raise the issue themselves, but in a more oblique way. So they may well send one of their flight ops inspectors to talk to the company and raise an issue generically. What about your rostering? How's it going, chaps? To try and raise an issue and investigate a little bit more than we could by just talking direct to the company. So that's sort of safety valve, safety net. And we're also about getting those reports that didn't really get to the stage where they were a formal incident or well, not accident, but a formal incident. So you might not write about the things the day you saved the day. That isn't an ASR type thing, perhaps, but if you write to us, we can publicise what happened and what the resolution was. Whistleblowing, I sort of goes hand in hand with what I said before, really. So you can come to us in confidence, even if you haven't been through the ASR process, and we can represent the issue to the company if possible, or perhaps more likely through the regulator, and they have a whistleblowing process as well, which we can use. And that's really just to make sure that if you don't feel you can raise your head above the parapet, then there's a route which you can do that with maintaining your anonymity, if you like. When I say anonymity, we don't accept reports ourselves with any contact details, but we do make sure your details are not passed on to other people. In the GA world, mostly, and cabin crew world as well, we sort of provide the agony aunt role. So people come to us, say, I'm not quite sure about what's going on. And very often we can provide them with a source to the regulations, so they understand the regulations, i.e. information flow or whatever. They may not know that. You know, most flight crew are pretty switched on with the regulations and understand them, but not quite the same down the back end of the cabin sometimes, where they don't understand the ins and outs of flight time limitations and whatever. So we quite often find ourselves providing that information, saying, yeah, you know, it may have felt wrong to you, but here's the regulations, and it may well be okay or not okay. And then we champion causes. So as I say, we pick up on themes, which is what we're doing now in this webinar, to try and advocate and provide the other perspective maybe of what's been going on. I mean, these days, investigations, and you heard from Rob, you know, some enlightened stuff there about human factors, isn't always the case, hasn't always been the case. So we try and champion those causes, you know, provide the sort of other perspective of, you know, the pilot in the loop, or the engineer or the air traffic or whatever, as somebody who prevented or saved the day or stopped the accident being worse than it might have been. And that's part of our role as well. Lastly, I think this is the last slide I got, reporting relationships. So this is a pyramid, you might have seen it before, I don't know, of a sort of theoretical relationship of accidents to incidents to reportable incidents to normal operations. And a guy called Heinrich did some review of it and worked out, don't get hung up on the numbers, that, you know, for every accident there are about 10 serious incidents or 30 other incidents and 600 things that go on in the aviation world. So it's a very rough approximation, but it just gives an idea of what we're trying to achieve. Top of the pyramid, of course, that's the CAA, what we've just talked about, ASRs, MORs, whatever, and Rob's team looking at the absolute top of the pyramid, fatal accidents and the serious incidents. And that's all well and good, but as far as we look at it from the CHIRP perspective, it's a bit like closing the stable door after the horse is bolted. So something has happened, it resulted in an incident, and we need to learn the lessons. So I'm being a bit pejorative there, it's not all that, but it's mostly about lagging indicators as far as a safety management theme is, looking at what we call sequel lessons, you know, trying to fix things after they've occurred, which in some parlance is called safety one, i.e. the first approach to safety. CHIRP is looking at the bottom end of the pyramid. So we're interested in all those things, those little errors, those things you didn't do, those things you did do to save the day at the bottom of that pyramid, and how we can learn from those. And we look at those as leading indicators. So things that didn't end up being an accident, but could do. So if they weren't resolved or weren't looked at, then it could be the source of an accident or an incident. And we call those precursor lessons, or safety two in some parlance. You know, learning about things before they become an issue, if you like. So that's the advert for CHIRP. Hopefully most of you are aware of CHIRP, but if not, that's what we're about and where we're coming from. The idea of this webinar, though, was to look at some themes from 2022 and where we can learn from that. So looking at our stats, I did a few slides just to look at the issues that have come across our desk. And the first thing to say is that 2022 saw us picking up on reporting after the COVID hiatus in flying. And it focused very much on the first part of the year was fairly quiet. I mean, aviation was picking up, as you know, but it really got going in the summer period when all the COVID restrictions went, and we started, going back to normal. Well, I say normal, near normal operations. So this slide shows the key issues which were reported. Now, for every report, we code things in our database for the key issues. I mean, use something called ADREP, which is an ICAO standard taxonomy for looking at reports. So we code them, and each report may have any number of issues involved in it, which I'll show you in a moment. So the fact that we're looking at 400 reports for duty and 350 for fatigue, whatever, those may well be the same reports but coded similarly. So we haven't had thousands of reports. In fact, I think we have had, on top of my head, about 400 or so reports in 2022 in total. And there's two interesting things. And so this is the top 10, and you can see top of the list is duty and rosters, really. Followed close by fatigue. So as you might imagine, duty rosters, very close allied to fatigue. So that's why they're pretty much the same. Pressures and goals, in terms of crews, flight crews, cabin crews, and whatever, feeling they are under undue pressure, sort of tied into rosters a bit as well, but it's a bit more than that. It's more about being pressured to keep the show on the road and do things that you might not always have done before. You might make shortcuts, might miss a few things out, i.e. trying to get that stop time, trying to get off the stand on time, and doing that in a environment where there is more to do. Post-COVID, more checks, more regulations, more hoops to jump through. So that's pressures and goals. Fourth on the list, communications, internal, and that's a little bit disappointing to a certain extent, and a bit of an own goal. It's all about companies not really communicating what they're trying to achieve to their workforce in an effective manner. And that's solvable, you would think. Bear in mind, though, some of this stuff in the company policies, etc., though the flight crew and cabin crew are not the only ones who are running to keep still, try and maintain rosters. The back office folk are also short on resource. So there are lots of new people in the back office activities, trying to do things, trying to keep the show on the road, may not be as familiar as the previous teams were. So company policies, communications are maybe some of the things which slip through the cracks. So that's why we've mentioned those. Relationship management is an issue which should be better than it is, and that's all about managers and not just managers in your line manager, but also those managing the activity. So crew control, ops control, maintenance control, all those sort of people not really being effective in what they're doing. And so we go down. I won't go through all of them. The other interesting thing to look at on that chart is the breakdown for each of those aspects. And you can see, if you can see the key below, so red is cabin crew, blue is the flight crew, and then purple is engineering. We get only a handful of engineering reports, has to be said, a handful of air traffic control reports. And as I mentioned before, so most of our activity is cabin crew reports, who I say they report because they're not so sure of regulations, but also they sometimes get the rough end of the deal, to be honest, and they don't have the same sort of protections as flight crew. But the flight crew side of life is, if I was to look at the length of those bars, then it's a slightly different story, isn't it? So company policies and relationship management and pressures and goals are the largest of the flight crew concerns, if you look at those carefully. So that's all about how the system is working, really. Yes, they're interested in fatigue and duty and rostering, but it's the communications and the interaction with the management. And I think things are getting better, but one of the things I was talking about last year was the breakdown, as I perceived it, in trust, if you like, between flight crew and management. The flight crew felt that the management side, it was all about the company pushing, and nobody was really taking enough notice of what the flight crew were saying, and the reports coming back about this duty mix or this roster is not sensible. And I'll amplify that a little bit on the next one. Now, this next slide, don't panic, it's a bit of an eye test, but I'm going to go through it in a bit more detail. So that's the same thing it says the same thing. It's what we call a sundial chart, but the outer ring breaks down each of those 10 that I mentioned into a little bit more fidelity, so you can see the sort of things which we're talking about. And I'm just going to skip to the next slide because that is an eye test. Hopefully that's not quite such an eye test. So looking at that duty thing then, as I mentioned, rostering is the key part of that. And that varies with company. There are some companies who are managing it better than others, and it's all down to resourcing. So having gone through the COVID pandemic, furloughing, laying off people, whatever, well, funny old thing, now we're back to trying to fill a full schedule, and there isn't enough flight crew, cabin crew, engineers or whatever to do that. And so companies, my perception, are beginning, well, not beginning, they have been last year, running the engine at the red line, as far as I'm concerned, to try and get the maximum out of it, to sweat the resources. Now that's okay, you can do that for a short amount of time, but you can't do that for a long period of time. And I think we're seeing that now becoming evident. Some of the companies I'm talking to, the flight crew are buffering up towards 900 hours in 12 months piece. So they've been pushed and pushed and pushed, and now it's, they're getting to the point where they just can't keep on doing that. Rest goes hand in hand with those rostering pieces. So there's only so much you can do. We've always maintained at CHIRP that the FTL limits are limits you should approach with caution in a managed way, and you shouldn't be running people at the red line of FTL limits the whole time. And a part of that is ensuring they have enough rest between rosters, between duties, should I say, on their roster, so they can properly recover, without going from one side of the world back home for a couple of days and off to the other side of the world, and then come back and do it all again. It just doesn't make sense. Length of duties, crewing, discretion and disruption. Discretion is an interesting one. Discretion gets raised quite a lot in the cabin crew side of life. They don't fully understand discretion, I don't think. We'll do our best to educate them. But also there's a hint that some companies are sort of expecting captains to use discretion. Discretion is there for unforeseen circumstances after you've checked in, basically, for your duty. And there's a hint that actually the roster relies on people using discretion rather than it being a doable duty. Now, there's nothing wrong with discretion. It's not an unsafe thing, provided it's used properly, and provided captains do properly review it and talk to the crew and work out who's where and what in their duties. So discretion is perfectly safe in that respect. But when you start relying on it in a roster, then it's not quite so sensible. So that's sort of a breakdown of the duty side. Oh, there we go. Pressures and goals. The way that breaks down is a perception of commercial financial constraints. Well, I say a perception, it's a reality, isn't it? Trying to maintain the company's head above water. And to a certain extent, there's a bit of understanding that the companies are going through an existential period. I mean, just look at Flybe the last couple of days. So there are huge commercial and financial constraints to try and wring everything out of the system that they can do. There's a recognition of that, but again, it's got to be done with care. Pressures from management, I sort of mentioned that already. The next one down is interesting: discrepancy between formal and informal practices. That's the difference between what the policy says and what's actually done. And there's a hint here and there that there's a mismatch there. I mean, take the discretion one I talked about. Most company, well, all company policies acknowledge discretion can be used, but that it will be for unforeseen circumstances. And there's a hint of some companies, as I say, relying on discretion. So that's that sort of aspect there. Discrepancy between formal and informal practices. Fatigue, only two areas there. That's the effects of fatigue and the management of fatigue. So I would say that's interesting in that I don't get a lot of reports of people saying I actually was fatigued. There are reports of that, don't get me wrong, but most of the concerns are in the management of fatigue in terms of rostering and whatever. People flagging up properly that this is going to be a dangerous position to get into. If you keep doing this to me, I will be fatigued. And that's exactly what I talked about in the previous slide about that pyramid, us trying to get information before the event occurs. So that's why management of fatigue is more of a bigger cheese wedge than the effects of. Company policies, I think they sort of speak for themselves. Operational policies, that's the, say, rostering, crew control, maintenance control, etc. Actually conducting the operation. Some concerns last year about cultures. Again, I'm not sure whether this overplays it to a certain extent, but people's lack of trust in management led to a sort of belief that just culture was on the back foot a bit, and it wasn't quite as prominent as it had been in the past. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know, because I'm not in the companies themselves, but certainly there's a reporting trend that some companies, just culture is not quite as strong as it could be. Relationship management, as I mentioned before, managers and their commitment to safety over their commitment to keeping the company afloat is a key aspect there. And then finally, the comms thing, as I mentioned before, internal communications from managers, and that is disappointing. You would expect managers to be communicating better when they're going through hard times than they are at the moment. Trying to inform, be transparent as best they can with the colleagues, flight, the crews and whatever. Because most of us would do what we can. We're in the company, we understand if the company goes bust, we lose our job. And if it's explained to you, here's what we're doing and here's why it's happening, then you're often more willing to do things. And if it's just a fait accompli, here's the latest policy document with the latest procedure, bang, off you go. So communication is important, and I think it's an art that is forgotten sometimes by managers. So that's a bit of background, a bit more fidelity into the whole thing that I mentioned about those key issues. I've sort of gone through these topic issues as I've sort of spoken, so I don't intend to go to too much depth other than they say what we're doing. So the first one, COVID-19 recovery, resources versus treasury resiliency. And I would highlight third-party operations at the last bit there. So it's not just flight crew, cabin crew, whatever. There's a lot of the ground handling staff who were made redundant during COVID, not even furloughed. And so this year, or back into this last year, and this year is seeing a big influx of new people being taken on in those sort of third-party ground handling environments, who may not know as much about aviation as you might expect them to know. This might be their first winter they're going through, so they don't understand a lot of that winter stuff maybe. So just a little warning signal there about third-party ground handling and their understanding and experience. Rostering and FTL, I've been through that in spades really. Absence of sickness management, that's an interesting one. We had quite a few reports last year about company policies for absence and sickness management. Some companies had policies whereby you took if you took a day off sick, then you lost a day's pay until the fourth day when statutory sickness pay comes in, and they have to pay you some derisory amount of whatever it is, $19.95 a day or something. So funny old thing in the aviation world, if you go off sick, we have much more stringent fitness requirements, fitness to fly requirements than most other industries might have. And so if you get doctor days pay, then that's a disincentive to go off sick. So people end up flying, operating when they're sick. We recently had a success story on that, I have to say. So one particular company, we represented that to the CAA, saying that this particular company's policy is not fit for purpose. And they engaged, and actually the company said, yeah, you're probably right, we need a better policy. And so there's been a change in company policy from one company, which is quite a pleasing sort of event for us to, something to come back that we made a change, if you like. Company cultures and relationships, I've gone into that quite heavily. Change management, now that's an interesting one as well for us. We've seen a bit of reporting trend about changes not being managed very well, and that goes back a little bit to what I talked about before, where the back office staff are also running hard to stand still, and so things are being brought in, changes are being made which may not have been as well thought out as we might have wished. User testing of new systems, new software, not really very well done before they were introduced. A lack of maybe those bringing in the change thinking about the risks. So we always say, well, you've got a safety management system, it's there, its entire purpose is to assess risks and look at where things may need to be modified. So use it. When you've got a change coming along, then run it through the safety management system and have a look at the risks. And there's a hint that that isn't happening sometimes. And that goes into the system. So that's what I talked about now. New kit coming in, quality of that kit not being quite, or the software not being quite up to spec. A lot of training these days being done as sort of self-help. So here you go, chaps. There's a new bit of software coming in. Here's the online training resource. Crack on and do it. And we'll bring it in a month's time or something. Well, that's all very well and good. Online training, nothing wrong with that to a certain extent, but some things are so big you need a bit of a face-to-face. You need somebody to say, okay, here's the important stuff that you need to think about or understand, and also you need to schedule that in. So it's not good enough for a company to say, okay, do it in your own time. Sometimes, I mean, if it's a small thing, then fine, but a big bit of software change or kit coming in, if you're expected to spend an hour or two of your own time doing it, that's not an issue. Perhaps you can do that, but when you just come back from the 12-hour sector and you're pretty dog tired, you're not going to be that keen to get on the online learning and find out about a new bit of kit that you're not that interested in. So more focused training, I think, is probably another issue we would talk about. Conscious of the time, Joji, so that's the key issues. Just about CHIRP, just to hammer home what we're about for everybody. Voluntary, confidential, independent, and just culture. That's our bag. And I said the independent thing is important. We are completely isolated in terms of our database and reporting processes. So you can be confident that your details are safe with us. And that we will apply a non-judgmental approach to any reporting. Advert for what we do. So if you haven't seen them, then we've recently refreshed our social media and website activities. So www.chirp.co.uk will get you onto our website. You can see our nice flashy new website, submit reports, look at our feedbacks and whatever. We also have an app which is on the right hand side of the screen there, which you do the same thing, submit reports from, all intended to make things easier to report, rather than being a bit of a pain of going through endless ASR type stuff. A report to CHIRP is hopefully as easy as we can make it. And our feedback newsletters go out once for every board. So every 3 months there's an air transport feedback that goes out. In fact, I'm literally about to publish one in the next week or so, once it's been finalised, which will summarise a bit of last year as well. We send those out to upwards of 30,000 people. We also send out on the Skywise, CA Skywise reporting system. So do subscribe to that if you haven't already. And we're on social media as well. I'm not particularly au fait with social media stuff. I'm sort of the wrong side of 40 for that. But we're on Facebook, we're on LinkedIn, and we have a Twitter feed as well. So that's us, human factors. We're all about getting that intelligence as a precursor. I mentioned the confidential stuff. I've mentioned how we hope we are user-friendly, and we are part of the safety team. So that's why we're here now talking at the moment. We're linked into all the other safety organisations, the Flight Safety Committee, GA Safety Council, obviously the CAA, and BALPA. Happy for questions when we come to them, Joji.
Excellent, thanks, Steve. Thank you for sharing those thought-provoking insights. It's interesting. CHIRP's key issues, I think, are very similar to those that our members share to us quite regularly. It's also interesting that many of your top 10 issues, I think, are systemic, organisational type things, and these have kind of then manifested themselves in real operations as symptoms. So things like fatigue become the symptoms of those organisational issues. Very interesting. So now we've got about half an hour or so for questions. What I'd like to do, there's been a few asked already by the audience, which Rob has kindly answered. I'd like to just go over those just for the benefit of the video, so people watching this later can hear the questions and the answers. So very quickly, first from Renz, is it possible that pilots were too preoccupied with the takeoff acceleration and they forgot to follow the published SID in that takeoff performance event at the beginning? Rob's response, the FISO is not allowed to clear the pilots to follow a SID. The routing from takeoff to the first waypoint is always at the commander's discretion. The second question we had, again relating to that event, do we know why the AAIB states that the turns are to the left, so in Finland, when clearly they have to turn to the right or risk infringing Russian airspace? So Rob's response to Olivia's question, the left turns after takeoff comes from the standard rules of the air, so it's not specific to Kusama. When an ATC surface is provided, a SID is used, but it's not allowed when a FIS, a FIS, is provided. The routing after takeoff is left to the pilot's discretion. So without confirmation of the planned routing, the FISO doesn't know where the aircraft will route. So Rob, just quickly, from those two questions, is there anything you'd like to add to those, or was that pretty much captured it?
No, I hope so. I hope that captures it, but happy to talk about it more if there's some more questions on that. Sure.
So, I mean, Renz, Olivia, if there's anything you want to follow up, then please type in the Q&A. Olivia did mention actually on the back of that, Rob, are you able to talk through any of the the recommendations? You mentioned the technical safety net that you've recommended, but you're able to talk through anything else on the back of that investigation in terms of recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, all the recommendations are in the report, so everyone can read those. They're all in the public domain. So we have there's recommendations and then there's safety action. Obviously, our ideal outcome from any investigation is that some organisations will take safety action. They'll just agree to do something, and then that's easier from our side of view. So certainly the operator in this case took quite a bit of safety action as a consequence of theirs and our investigation. So they now, for example, with the turn after departure, there's now a note in their route information manual that tells pilots that they need to report that they'll be turning right. So they've also provided training now about use of brakes and put some extra bits in there, sim checks about cold weather ops, all on account, and they've done some training, I believe, on distraction as well. So, but in terms of actual safety recommendations, there's two recommendations in the report that we kind of alluded to already. One about trying to get some sort of takeoff performance monitor, and there's various solutions out there. But the first step is really to get regulators across the world to agree on a set of safety standards for how one will work. And then the second one is about takeoff performance data monitoring. So trying to get triggers into operators' flight data monitoring systems so that we can find out more of these events, because we think they're quite underreported at the moment. There's a lot more events out there. So that's the kind of two recommendations that are in the report.
Right, thank you, Rob. There's a couple of sort of more technical questions around kind of impaired runways generally. One from David: how would a pilot perceive a difference between slide and roll on a surface with impaired friction?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing, I guess, as a pilot sat on the flight deck. You can't. I think it's the short answer. The aircraft is just moving, and in that moment, you probably have no way of knowing which it is. I guess in this case, they perceived it was sliding, possibly because they'd spoken about that, rather than thinking that it might be insufficient brakes. But there's no way of knowing at the time that there is which it is. I mean, it's only something we can look at in the data afterwards.
Right. And a question from Dale: does the AAIB have a view in the use of derated thrust on contaminated runways. The follow-up should minimising time and runway be given higher priority, perhaps over the associated maintenance costs.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. It's one that's come up a few times, really. I'm not sure I can give an AAIB view on such things. Tricky question, really, because it's, as you all know, it'll be engine life and cost versus, you could argue we'd always do full power takeoffs everywhere because it's safer and we'll get off the ground quicker. But then, yeah, so interesting debate. I don't think I can give a kind of AAIB view answer on that. But
Sure. Okay. Slight change of tack in terms of questions, and we could probably address this one to you, Steve, as well, for your general feedback you've heard through CHIRP. This is from John. So John feels there's two areas that seem to crop up over the many years in terms of these sort of events, not just takeoff performance, but where incorrect reback is perhaps not picked up, or where there's deviation away from standard operating procedures. And the question is, what could be done to try to ensure these basics are not overlooked? So by both Rob and Steve, for your thoughts.
I think one that is relevant to what we've seen, failure to adhere to standard operating procedures is one of the issues John raises, and we do see that failure to follow procedures, whatever you want to call it. I'd say I probably see it more in the GA world than I see it in the professional world, because I think in the professional world it's very much more scripted in terms of following checklists. It's my experience, having sat on the jump seat a few times, whereas in the GA world it's a little bit more prone to people doing things from memory. Without checklists. So I mean, yes, we get in both worlds though. In the GA world, people simply forgetting to do things because they're rusty, they're not well trained, and our advice is, in those sort of circumstances, to just take 5 seconds to think about what you're doing, or if you're rushing to get airborne at the end of the runway GA, then pause to think about it and make sure you have actually gone through that sort of thing. Easy to say, but it's not a foolproof thing. And then in the flight crew side of life, it's a lot of it is down to ensuring there's been a proper pre-brief, I think, and to augment the crew. So, for example, we've had things, pre-takeoff sort of things, where one of the issues we responded to last year was failure to call V1 because they were automated systems. And some aircraft in the fleet were automated and some weren't automated. And so there was a report to us saying that people were relying on the automation, and when it doesn't happen, they forget to make the call. So that's a human factors piece, really. I mean, if you're expecting it to happen, then it's very easy to go, well, the aircraft's going to do it. And then if you haven't really briefed that, well, actually, this is one of the manual aircraft, which doesn't have automatic V1 call out, then you've forgot to do it. So that's part of that is pre-briefing, before you get to the end of the runway, or at the end of the runway, or whatever. Chat with the crew, this aircraft's got automatic V1, it hasn't got automatic V1, so whatever. I mean, our recommendation is call them out anyway, even if it's automatic, but in case for some bizarre reason the automatic system didn't work. That would be our overall message. But then it's the expectation that automatics are going to work every time. Maybe that's a human factors failing, and that's why we have the call outs. So I agree. I think fairly full of procedures. It's a hard one, isn't it? Because the procedures are there, they're written, but they're not used. So that's one of these work as imagined versus work as done pieces. And I guess it's in the commercial world, focusing on actually doing the procedures. Easy to say when you're not 1 minute behind the slot time, and you've got to get airborne, and it's all a bit of a rush. So I don't have an answer. I don't know if Rob's got anything else to say.
I mean, for this one, I mean, I wouldn't really see it as a failure to follow procedures. I think that it was a very good crew trying to do the best job they can, certainly in the event specific one we were talking about earlier. So yeah, I didn't really perceive this as a kind of a failure to follow procedures. It's interesting talking about you're just mentioning the V1 calls on a system that's inherently generally very reliable and always works. It's almost impossible to expect a pilot to catch it the one time it doesn't work, when every time through their career it always does work. So it's more of a technical design for that model, because pilots will almost certainly miss that sort of thing. I think it's hard to expect them to. So yeah, it's tricky with procedures like that, because when distraction comes along, is it reasonable to expect people to not miss things in the procedure? It's almost inevitable that will happen, I think. It's kind of why we're pushing for technical solutions in things for events that occur in such a time critical situation. There will always be, I don't think we can ever get to expect humans to never miss anything. It's just not possible. So.
Thank you for that. I think, Steve, the point you made about understanding kind of why it made sense at the time for the pilot or controller or the engineer, whatever, to do what they did, which may have been outside of procedures, sort of understanding what the thought process was there. Could there be something about the procedure or the equipment or a situation that made absolute perfect sense to do that? And could that be fed back into the SOP itself? Could it be optimized? Could it be improved? Interesting. So we've had some pre-prepared questions, so questions sent in advance for this session. And some of these questions are sort of grouped into themes around challenges to investigation and reporting, themes around maximizing the potential to learn from events, and also maybe a look to the future, what might be coming over the horizon. So if we could take some questions around those themes. For Rob, in terms of effective incident accident investigation, what do you see as the challenges for that? And for Steve, in terms of the reports that you get from CHIRP, challenges that make those reports actionable for you as an organisation. What are the challenges that you see?
I guess the ongoing challenge for us is often early reporting, so getting to evidence quick enough. When things aren't reported quickly enough, or inaccurately reported, quite often we get reports. The initial report sounds quite minor, so our response is smaller, but then you find out later on it's more significant than we realised. And that way we just lose evidence. So things like cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders, we don't get to them quick enough, so they've been overwritten, or don't get to speak to people, and people's memory changes with time if you don't speak to someone for a week or something. So early reporting is probably one of the sort of ongoing issues. But looking to the future, I guess the issues for us is new technology. We're starting to look into space investigations at the moment from the sort of Virgin event a couple of weeks back. So there's new areas for us. All the drones that are appearing at the moment is becoming much more work for us from that side of it, and then moving into these sort of urban mobility vehicles that are being developed at the moment is kind of very much a new area for us that's having to expand our knowledge and get involved in that side of things. So it's probably the kind of area for the future. Electric aircraft appearing now, and suddenly having to switch all our knowledge from jet aircraft and piston engines to suddenly electric motors and things. So it's, yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
I think from my side, the challenges we've got in CHIRP are, well, firstly, it's making sure we get both sides of the story. So as you can imagine, we get a report coming through, it can be quite emotional sometimes. Something's happened, and we get the full bore of information from one person's perspective, and so non-judgmental and all that sort of thing. We've got to then look at the other side of the story. So if we don't have, if the audit doesn't allow us to contact the company, for example, because they fear for their confidentiality, we're in a bit of a cleft stick. So what can we do there? Because we can't contact to verify some information. We can generically make some responses and find out what's going on, but it's always a big challenge for us to make sure we understand fully the circumstances. And also, because we are not in a particular company, we might not have access to a particular company's policies or the OMA or whatever. So it's trying to understand what's going on before we then go off half-cocked maybe and launch into something where we end up going, well, actually, here are the facts. Oh, okay. So that's one challenge for us with reporting. Ensuring confidentiality is always another issue, which that's always the top of our pile. And if there's any doubt, then there's no doubt we don't engage with companies, because we just are very well aware that there are some companies who are not enlightened. If they find out who the reporter is, even to the extent in the past, before my time, we've sent emails off to companies asking for information which included elements of the report, and those elements have been checked and put through whatever text recognition type stuff a company might have, and they've identified the reporter through that by particular circumstances or whatever. So very, very, very concerned about that, and that, I say, does cause us to have an issue with how we go about reporting. And then I suppose the other thing is reporting overall. We saw a bit of a dip in reporting autumn last year. I don't know why that was, because people were doing more and there's more things going on. You'd think there'd be more reporting. Maybe that was because they didn't have time to report. I don't know, or didn't feel they wanted to. At the end of the day, they've just done a whatever hour sector duty period, and they just can't be bothered with that report. So it's getting people to report, and getting people to report those what might be seen as being minor issues. So the little things. That's the bread and butter for CHIRP. Those little things which out of that might come there's a little theme there. That's something which we could get engaged with before something happens. And I sort of call that I learned about flying from that stuff, betraying my previous past probably. And we were always after people giving us that sort of anecdotal stuff. This thing happened and I did this. It wasn't an incident, it wasn't an accident, but you know what? It was something I learned about, and it may be useful for others. So that's important. And then the fourth of three, ground handling. We've recently started the ground handling reporting program because we perceive there must be lots of things going on in ground handling, which we don't know about, because the ground handling world is very insecure. People are hired and fired, pretty easily in the ground handling. There are plenty of people out there who can drive a truck and do whatever, bit of training, and you're on the ramp before you know it. So there's an issue there. So we're trying to get penetration to get those sort of sectors to report to us as well, and raise issues, again, to try and get ahead of the curve. So I think that's the sort of overall reporting challenges we have at CHIRP, I think.
Thank you, Steve. So in terms of, you've done the investigation, followed up, you've worked out what needs to be done to improve things. So from like a technical failure point of view, if there's an issue with the design of something, and you do the research and you come up with a solution and you have to implement it, I guess that's reasonably straightforward, other than obviously the costs associated with that. It's quite straightforward to get things implemented. But in terms of systemic organizational improvements and the sort of things, Steve, that you were drawing out in some of your CHIRP, top 10 issues, that feels much more difficult. So do you have any thoughts in terms of how you might maximize organizational learning through whether it's accident investigation or follow-up of reports? So both to Rob and Steve.
Yeah, I'll kick off on that. So what we get involved, as mentioned, the CAA. So we do feed intelligence to the CAA. That sounds a bit clandestine intelligence, doesn't it? But what I mean is information. So whether the audience know it or not, so regularly the CAA conduct what they call entity assessments, where they will look at a particular company on a periodic basis, and they'll say, okay, let's just have a whiteboard view of this company. What's going on? What do we think of it? What's its profile? How is it managing? So that's one of the key areas where we can actually feed stuff in, whereas we might not be able to do it on an individual report. We can feed in, do you know what, we've had X number of reports about rostering from this company. They seem to be doing this, they seem to be doing that, whatever, you need to look at, or we think you need to look at their rostering process, or whatever it might be. I'm choosing rostering because that's a hot topic at the moment. So that's a way for us to then feed the CAA that we think there's an issue. And actually, remember I mentioned that success about absence reporting, sickness reporting. We did that. We got a load of reports for this company about sickness and pay being deducted for days off sick. And the CAA were able to go to that company and enact change. Now, we can't enact that ourselves. If we go to a company and say, well, actually, that's not true. I do go to the company and say, I've got extra reports about whatever. What's your view? I may get a nice email back saying, thanks so much for your reports, whatever. We'll have to think about it. Difficult for us to get any purchase unless it's a really enlightened company. We go, yeah, thanks so much. That is, it's an important issue. We will do something about this. And there are companies out there who do that. They're not universal. So the best way for us to do is go through the CAA, the entity assessment route, or whatever. And we don't just wait for the entity assessment. If there's an issue of the day, then ad hoc, I'll go to the flight ops and say, hey, flight ops, there's an issue here with this company. You may wish to be aware. They might come back and say, yeah, we're aware of that. Thanks so much. But that just confirms and gives us more information. Or they may go, yeah, well, that's a new one. We don't talk about that, or we weren't aware of that. Thanks so much. That we'll make an investigation. So hard for us to enact systemic change in the CHIRP perspective. So we have no authority, no levers to pull. It's all about people doing the right thing, if you like, as far as we're able to do things. Although I do have the ability, and I can talk straight into the CEO of the CAA if I wanted to. I know him and he knows me, and I could say, company X needs sorting out. I don't think I've ever done that, but I could theoretically do that, I suppose, if I really felt that invigorated about something. But do you know what, flight ops? I know we all like to moan about flight ops and CAA and all this stuff going on, but actually they are pretty responsive to CHIRP, and they do try their best to ferret about and look at what the issues we're raising.
Thanks, Rob. Anything to add to that from an AAIB perspective?
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, I might kind of sort of challenge the question a little bit, in that I actually find the opposite is true. Actually, if we want a technical solution to a problem, that's hugely difficult, because of the exorbitant cost of making a technical change to a whole fleet of aircraft is phenomenally expensive, and someone's going to pay for that, whether it's the operators or the manufacturers. And there's huge resistance to doing that. It's much easier to change a procedure, change something in a manual, ask companies to operate a little differently. So I almost think the opposite is true. Actually, some of the sort of organisational change is sometimes easier to implement because the cost isn't, the physical money required isn't as large. It's just a case of winning the argument. So I mean, my experience is often, if you go to most companies, generally are trying to do the best job they can. They want to be safe. And if you go to them with a robust argument that says this has happened, this is what we can do about it, actually that's generally received pretty well. Most organisations are happy to learn, and certainly that's been my experience. But yeah, when money gets involved and you're talking about changes that are going to cost an awful lot of money, that's when things get difficult, for obvious reasons. There's not that much money out there in aviation. Paying for things is going to be difficult. So.
Okay, that's reassuring to hear. Thank you. Looking at time, so I think we can probably finish on a couple of questions. One of them, we will not hold you to the answer to this. It's just interesting to get your thoughts and insights into this. And the other one is a bit sort of broader. So, in terms of the future, so looking to the future, and Rob, you already mentioned sort of changes in concepts of operation and types of vehicle and that sort of thing. But in terms of, if you had to look at the crystal ball and predict what the future big virus accident was going to be, what sort of scenario would you see that being? And the second question is, if you could see one thing changed, if you were able to implement one big change to help the industry become safer, what would that be?
If you like, I'll make it quick. So for me, I think in the immediate future and medium-term future, to me, I think the issue on the human side of life is fatigue. From what I'm seeing, a lot of people being stretched much further than they should be. And I think that, I mean, I'm talking about, not the long-term future, but hopefully we'll sort this out about resourcing. But at the moment, it's fatigue. And in terms of the fix to all that, I think, to me, it's a regulatory issue. Well, the companies, of course, have got to look to themselves, but we've adopted the EASA regulatory set as the UK regulations. A few little tweaks here and there at the moment, but in typical EASA fashion, everything is very woolly, and there's no sort of set. It's all about, you should do this, you might do this, and if you don't mind doing this, please do. And I think we need to look at those regulations, look at them from a UK perspective, and be much more prescriptive in, companies are to do this, are not to do this, or whatever.
Thanks, Steve.
I guess in the short term, I'll sort of go back to the presentation. Takeoff performance events are probably what we see as one of the biggest threats at the moment. So yeah, and that's why we're sort of trying to campaign for a technical solution. Come back to the previous question, the procedural change fixes and trying to tweak SOPs and things is not ultimately going to solve the problem. It's a technical solution. So that's really the big change we're after at the moment, to put some technical solution onto the aircraft that will prevent these events happening.
And thank you, Rob, for that answer. And Steve, I mean, I said there were just 2 questions, but maybe just one very final quick one. You mentioned, Steve, EASA regulations. Obviously, we've now left the EU, we've left the EASA system, but obviously we're still working with retained EU legislation. In terms of whether it's investigations or safety, broader safety reporting, have you noticed anything different since we left the EU, tangibly different, or is it pretty much what's normal in terms of that?
For me, no, I haven't noticed a thing in particular from the Brexit side of life. I mean, we just carried on and used the same regulation, so I wouldn't say I've seen any change. My point is, there is opportunity for change to make things better, I think. So we could change things by improving that. I mean, the biggest thing is obviously is COVID in the last couple of years, and there has been a huge change. Fatigue has always been an issue for reporting at CHIRP, but just at the moment, the post-COVID recovery, the resourcing, it's not just flight crew, by the way, it's air traffic control as well. There is a worldwide shortage of air traffic controllers, and they are all having to do their shift patterns and breaks and whatever, and there aren't enough air traffic controllers. So that's the post-COVID issue, but I wouldn't say that was an EASA Brexit issue. We just haven't taken advantage of the changes we could make, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I don't think we've really noticed day-to-day any real change. Some of the committees and things we used to attend, we're not invited to anymore, and there's little things like that. But it's nothing significant's really changed. But yeah, it's interesting from a regulatory point of view whether we're now able to implement, as Steve was saying, different changes in the UK. There's certainly some potential there. So.
Great stuff. Well, mindful of the time, and we just hit 12 o'clock. I'm going to draw this session to a close. So I feel it's been productive. There's been interesting discussions. So big thank you to Rob, Steve. Your interesting and thoughtful insights, and also your openness and candour about what you do. Thanks also to the audience for your attendance and your questions. I hope you found the session as insightful from your end as it certainly was from mine. And certainly last but by no means least, thank you to the organising team behind all of these webinars. I mentioned this is the fourth one today. A big special shout out to Phil Tanner at GATCO. I think hopefully Phil's in the background online, and also to Mike Furrow at BALPA for helping to organise these sessions. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the final webinar of the symposium this year. Recordings of all 4 sessions will be made available on the BALPA and GATCO websites. So if you missed one of the early ones and you want to catch up, then they'll be there shortly. If you've enjoyed these webinars, we'd like to know more about the work of BALPA and GATCO. Then you might be interested to know that a group's been established to facilitate greater interaction and knowledge sharing between our communities. So to learn more about this work, to express an interest maybe, or just to learn more about BALPA at GATCO, we've just put up a slide that shows contact details, so email and website. So please feel free to look at those. So once again, thanks to all of you. Take care, stay safe, and hopefully see you again at the next symposium. All the best. Bye-bye.